So this is chapter 15. I just want to make sure we're recording. How many times did you guys hear me say that? I want to make sure we're, where'd it go? Make sure we're recording. Yep. So chapter 15 is the autonomic nervous system. So that's what we're going to do now. Okay, so every time I start something, right, I tell you things are organized in different manners. So sometimes they're organized by function and sometimes they're organized by physiology. Okay, so let's talk about the somatic nervous system because I don't want to use pink, huh? Okay, so the somatic nervous system is stuff, so we say SNS for it is the abbreviation. So it's stuff that we actually are aware of and we're thinking about and we're controlling. Okay, so we've talked about this before. So somatic sensory, it signals from our special senses, so hearing and seeing and equilibrium, what you taste, what you smell, and touch, things from your skin, and then proprioceptors. And we'll talk about those in the next chapter, but proprioceptors are detecting like where you are in space, like how your body is moving. Okay, so that's somatic, things that we're consciously aware of. Okay, somatic motor is going to take the information, it's going to send it out. Okay, so if it's voluntary, it's going to involve your cerebrum, your higher order thinking. But if it's reflexive, it's just going to go to the brainstem or go to the spinal cord. Okay, now here's a picture of somatic nervous system. So here we have senses, right? So the information we're picking up, and it's going to go in the back door of the spinal cord, right, in the back, and then it's going to come out the front, and it's going to cause the skeletal muscle to move. So you're aware of what's going on. So that's somatic. Okay, now, autonomic nervous system is what this chapter is devoted to. Okay, so they abbreviated ANS. Okay, sometimes they call it the visceral motor system, sometimes they call it autonomic. For the most part, we call it autonomic nervous system. Okay, so it's things that we're not thinking about. Okay, so it's not things that we're consciously aware of. It's going to take information from the central nervous system and it's going to go to the heart, the smooth muscle, and the glands. Okay, so it's going to respond to things that are visceral, things that are deep within you. So maybe like blood pressure or and what's going on in your blood vessels. Blood pressure is a good example. Okay, now what it's going to do, the whole point of this autonomic nervous system, this is the big thing, okay, is that it's going to try to maintain homeostasis. So what the job of the autonomic nervous system is, so you should make sure you know this, okay, it's going to keep our body doing what it needs to do without us thinking about it. Okay, so it's going to maintain homeostasis. Okay, so here is autonomic nervous system, the little picture comparing them. Okay, so here's sensory receptors in the viscera. Okay, so say your lungs, and we're detecting stretch, perhaps. Okay, the sensory information is going to come in, okay, and it's not going to go straight to the spinal cord. Okay, it's got to take a different route. So it's going to come in, okay, and this is what we have to talk about. It's going to go in the back door. Okay, and then the information is going to come out and we're going to make a change. Okay, and so it's going to cause some sort of change in the viscera. So all of this stuff, okay, is what we're going to talk about in this chapter. Okay, so we have preganglionic autonomic motor neurons. Okay, and then we have ganglion. So we're gonna talk about all of this and try to put it all together. Okay, now we're going to compare the lower motor neurons of the somatic system with the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so the lower motor neurons of the somatic nervous system is just basically a single lower motor neuron, and it's going to go from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscle. Okay, they release acetylcholine. They're usually myelinated, so they're big. The information is going to go fast, and it's going to start in the brainstem or the spinal cord. Okay, now, lower motor neurons of the autonomic nervous system are not as straightforward. Okay, so they're going to use a chain of two neurons to reach the end. Okay, so they call it a chain. So it's more than one put together. Okay, so the first one we call the preganglionic neuron. Okay, so it starts in the brainstem or the spinal cord. Okay, it's thin, it's not a big thick one. Okay, and it goes to these things called autonomic ganglion, and they're part of the PNS. Okay, they're going to release acetylcholine, and they're going to excite a second motor neuron. The second one we call the ganglionic, or we used to call it the postganglionic neuron. Okay, so there's going to be one, and then there's going to be another, and they have to talk to each other. Okay, so it has a cell body, so it's going to originate in this thing called the autonomic ganglion, which we haven't talked about yet. So they're really thin, they're unmyelinated, and they're going to go to the cardiac, to the heart, to smooth muscle, which you're going to remember is in your blood vessels or in your GI tract, or they could go to a gland. Okay, now they can release two different neurotransmitters. So they could release acetylcholine or they could release norepinephrine. So they might excite or inhibit these three things. Okay, so they could get them going or they could stop them. Okay, so here is a diagram. Hopefully that helps make sense of how the lower motor neurons are going to work in the ANS. Okay, so here's your spinal cord. Okay, so here comes the preganglionic out. So it's going to come out. Okay, and then it's going to meet in this ganglion. Okay, so this is where the synapse is. This one releases acetylcholine. Okay, and then the postganglionic neuron has receptors on it that are called nicotinic receptors. Okay, they are going to get the signal, and then they're going to go to the effector. So in this case, this is the small intestines. Okay, and they're going to say what to do next. Okay, so pre and post. Look, this one has myelin. This one doesn't. Okay, now, why does the autonomic nervous system have two neurons instead of one? Okay, so what's going to happen is this funky thing called neuronal convergence or neuronal divergence. Okay, so if we converge, that means things are going to come to one place, but if we diverge, right, they're going to separate. So if we draw a picture, right, if we converge, we're coming from a bunch of different places to one point, and if we diverge, right, we're going like that. Okay, why do we want to do that? What's the advantage of doing that? Okay, we'll get there. Okay, so I know it's kind of, we'll talk about it. I'll explain it here in a second. Okay, now the autonomic nervous system is regulated by some of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so this is all the stuff that it's just keeping you alive. It's keeping you breathing. It's keeping you digesting your food. It's regulating your blood pressure. Okay, so the hypothalamus, okay, controls two parts of the autonomic nervous system, which we haven't talked about the two parts yet. Okay, so it has what we call the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, now the sympathetic nervous system, is fight or flight. Okay, so we're kind of doing it in a different order, but I'm trying to follow the book. So the hypothalamus is going to be important because it has part of our emotion, right? So the hypothalamus could be influenced by your higher order thinking or your memories. Okay, now the brainstem, the nuclei there, are going to help regulate the blood pressure. And then the spinal cord is going to regulate defecation and urination, so pooping and peeing. Okay, so we have to talk about parasympathetic and sympathetic, but that's coming up here in a minute. Okay, so here's a picture, and this is a better way. I think it's more simple to see. So the hypothalamus is going to do autonomic functions. So the stuff that you don't necessarily think about, but it's controlled by hormones, right? So it's involved in emotions. The brainstem has reflex centers for heart rate and breathing rate, how strong your heartbeat is. And then the spinal cord that's where urination and defecation come from or originate. Okay, now there are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. See, I wish, oh well. Okay, so two divisions. One is called the parasympathetic division, and one is called sympathetic. Okay, parasympathetic. I had a student one time, she was a massage therapist. So they said parasympathetic is when you're at peace. Okay, so P and P. So it's when you're resting and digesting. Okay, so you're just sitting, you're calm, you're conserving energy, you're breaking down your food. Everything is always right in the world. Okay, sympathetic nervous system is when you're maybe under stress. Okay, so it's fight or flight. So it is turned on when you're exercising, it's an emergency, or you're excited. Okay, so parasympathetic and sympathetic. All right, now if we break these down and we compare them, okay, I'm always about compare and contrast. Okay, parasympathetic, and we're comparing the lower motor neurons. I'm going to show you a picture and this will help. So parasympathetic are going to originate in the brain or the sacrum. Okay, here, let me show you. Let me show you the picture. Okay, so this is easier to see, and you can go back and read the words. Okay, so parasympathetic is on this side, and sympathetic is on this side. So parasympathetic they also call it the craniosacral division. So it's coming from your head, okay, and there are 4 cranial nerves involved, and it's coming from the sacrum. Okay, it has short postganglionic axons, but long preganglionic axons. So basically what that means is the message is coming out from here and it's going all the way out to the place where it needs to act. Okay, so it goes all the way out and then it synapses. Okay, so rest and digest is that one. Okay, now sympathetic, okay, that's the stress one, right? So it comes out of the thorax, so it's the purple, and the lumbar area. Okay, so it's coming from here to here. Okay, how it's set up is it has a short preganglionic neuron and a long postganglionic neuron. So what that means is the information can actually spread out and stimulate your organs from from a place close to the spinal cord. So this is divergent. Okay, so think about it. If you need to save yourself from the bear or from whatever, a zombie, okay, you want to be able to get information to all of your body parts as fast as you can so that you're getting blood to your legs so you can run, so you can breathe fast, so your heart beats faster, and you're not worried about digesting. Okay, so all of this stuff is going to get turned on really fast because it's going to go to a central point and then it's going to split. This is when everything is calm and the information is going to get sent all the way to the stomach, right, or the small intestines, and then it's going to come out. Okay, so those are two big differences, structural differences about how the autonomic nervous system works. Okay, now on here, this is a part we haven't talked about yet. This is the sympathetic trunk. So the sympathetic trunk, guess what? It's part of the sympathetic nervous system. And it's paired, right? So you have it on both sides. And it's outside the spinal cord. And it's going to connect. Spinal nerves are going to connect to it. And then information can go up and down it. Okay, now, how do these two things respond? So comparing the PNS and the SNS. Okay, well, I guess I should just say parasympathetic, and I don't want to confuse you. Para and sympathetic. Okay, so parasympathetic is really localized. So the information is coming from the spinal cord and it's going out and it's almost going to the effector and then it's synapsing. So it's they call it localized. Okay, so the information is getting straight to the point. Okay, now sympathetic is mass activation. So basically with it, what happens is you're taking the information, it's going to these ganglia, and then it's going out and it's going as fast as it can, as many places as it can. Sometimes it can be just one effector, but lots of times if it's exercise or you're afraid of something, it's more than one effector getting turned on at one time. Okay, the sympathetic nervous system also triggers the adrenal medulla to release its hormones. Okay, so this one I always think of, if you want to get the message out. Okay, so parasympathetic would be just calling and talking to one person and telling them exactly what you want to tell them and turning them on. And sympathetic would be more like using a group Snapchat thing where you're telling 20 people at one time and you have them all in a group. And then that information gets spread out as fast as it possibly can to whoever you need it to go to. Okay, now, parasympathetic, the whole idea is we're going to maintain homeostasis. And I already said this, so it's craniosacral is where it's found. The ganglia, so where the synapses are, where the neurons are going to come together, are located close to the effector, or they could be in the wall of the target organ. Okay, so parasympathetic has 4 cranial nerves that are part of it. So the ocular motor, the facial, the glossopharyngeal, and the vagus nerve. Okay, so it can change the eye constriction of the pupil, salivary glands. This is salivary glands. Okay, and the vagus nerve, it runs down to your abdominal organs, so it can regulate what's going on down there. Okay, now, I think, okay, so the parasympathetic also, okay, so the sacral part, Okay, so the part that's in your pelvis or sacrum, right? It's going to go, and it's going to go to abdominal and pelvic effectors. Okay, so it can do increased digestion and production of urine. Okay, it's going to cause your GI tract to contract. Okay, and it's going to cause the penis and the clitoris to become erect. So all of that is happening while you're resting. Okay, so this picture is trying to show you and I know this is overwhelming because there's so much stuff on it, but here's what I want you to get. Parasympathetic is craniosacral, right? So it's coming out of the brain or it's coming out of the sacrum. Here's what it's going to do, okay? So the cranial nerves, it kind of shows you, okay? So we have tears, salivary glands, okay? We can control the heart rate. Okay, it can go to the vagus nerve will go down, right? And it'll go to the things in the chest and the abdominal cavity. Okay, and then the sex organs too. Okay, so parasympathetic, things that get turned up, right, will be digestion, urination, sex organs, right? Anything to do with digestion, okay? Heart rate will go down. Hopefully your blood pressure goes down. Those things will slow down. Okay, now, sympathetic, we've kind of went through a lot of these. So exercise in emergency or stress or fight or flight, people say. Whoops, I did it wrong. Okay, so fight or flight. No, I didn't do it wrong. Okay, so thoracic and lumbar. Okay, so it's coming from the middle of your body. Okay, the ganglia, so the where the nerves are going to synapse, it's close to the brain and the spinal cord, but it's not the brain and the spinal cord. And it's really complex. So we're going to try to make it as simple as we can. Okay, so the sympathetic trunk, so I don't have a picture. Okay, the sympathetic trunk or the sympathetic chain, okay, they run alongside the spinal cord. Okay, so I know what you saw it on some of the spinal cord models, but I didn't make a big deal about it. Okay, so they describe it kind of like a pearl necklace. So it's these like beads, and it's separate. They're connected, but with neurons. Okay, so it's these things that are in white, or I guess it's kind of pearl color. Okay, so they're running alongside the spinal cord. Okay, now, so here's the thing. So they're paired, right? Pearl necklace, the strings are the axons, okay? And then the pearls are the ganglia. So that's where the synapses are and the cell bodies. Okay, so usually there's one ganglion with each spinal nerve. Okay, but the neck portion of the trunk, so the cervical portion, only has 3 ganglia. So there's a superior, a middle, and inferior cervical ganglia. I'm not too worried about that. Okay, so here's what happens. Okay, so the cervical ones are going to go to the heart and the lungs and the eyes. Okay, so think about what happens to you if you're scared. All right, so pupils dilate, heart rate goes up, right? What happens to respiratory rate? goes up. Okay, what do you think is going to happen to your digestion at that point in time? You are not worried about digesting your food, so that's going to slow down, right? You're not worried about making urine. That's the least of your worries. Okay, what about reproduction? That's not going to happen either. Okay, now, if you look, there are all these paths, all these different colored lines. So we're going to talk about it and try to make that as straightforward as I can. Okay, so here is a dissection, okay, of trying to show the sympathetic trunk. Okay, so here's the aorta and the vena cava, so the big blood vessels. Okay, here's ribs, right? And then here's the sympathetic trunk, and the ganglia are kind of like here. And you can see on this picture, they made it yellow. Okay, now, the sympathetic trunk has to talk to the spinal cord. Okay, so it's got to get the information that's coming from your brain, right? It has to communicate with your central nervous system. So the way that it communicates is these things that are called, and I don't probably pronounce it very well, rami communicantes. Okay, so there's white ones and there's gray ones. Okay, so the white ones are going to be myelinated. Okay, and they're going to be the on-ramps to the trunk, how we get to the trunk. And then the gray ones are going to be the exit ramps from the trunk. So how do we get off of the sympathetic trunk? Okay, now, axons leave the sympathetic trunk by one of 4 ways. So there's 4 different ways it can go. So the first one is the spinal nerve pathway. Okay, so I'll show you. Okay, so the spinal nerve pathway, what can happen, right, is the information comes from the skin, right, or the blood vessel, and it goes in, and it can go, this is the green is the post, wait a minute, preganglionic enters the trunk and synapses with the ganglionic post, travels through the gray ramus at the same level and joins that spinal nerve and extends to the effector. Okay, so I'm trying to see I'm having a hard time seeing the gray. Okay, so here's the pre. So the information is coming out of the spinal cord, right? And it's going to go out like this. And it's going to go out this ramus, okay? And then it will go from there it'll synapse, okay? And then it'll go to the effector. Okay, so one way it can go is the spinal nerve way. Okay, so it can come out like this, go down, and then out. Okay, I don't know if that makes any sense, but but that's one way it can go is the spinal nerve. Okay, another way that it can go is it can go out this post-ganglionic sympathetic nerve pathway. All right, so in this case, what happens is it comes out, it goes to the ganglion, okay, and then it goes to where it needs to make a change. Okay, the third way is called the splenic nerve pathway. Okay, so this is going to be in the abdomen and the pelvis. Okay, and what it'll do is it'll come out and it'll go up or down the sympathetic chain, and then it'll go out. Okay, now the fourth way is it can go to the adrenal medulla. Okay, so it can come out and it can go down and it can go to the adrenal medulla, and it's going to tell the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine or norepinephrine. Okay, so think about this. So if you're in fight or flight, right, and you're trying to get away from the bear or whatever you're trying to get away from, the zombie is probably better because you're not supposed to run away from a bear. You want to have a longer lasting effect, right? You need something to keep going because you need to be able to continue to get away from the zombie. You don't want to poop out right after you get the initial surge of energy. So the epinephrine and the norepinephrine are going to go around and they're going to circulate in your blood and they're going to keep you going. Okay, so 4 basic pathways. Okay, so one is the spinal nerve. One is this postganglionic sympathetic nerve pathway. Okay, one is splenic nerve. And one is adrenal medulla. And it depends on what's going on in your body, okay, or where in your body it's happening. Okay, I'm not going to ask you to trace these, right? But I want you to know that the sympathetic system, it's not just going to be one straightforward, okay, we're sending the information straight to the effector and we're going to cause a change to occur. There's 4 different ways the information can go, and the information is going to get distributed quickly to your whole body. And it's not direct, it's more divergent is what they call it. Okay, now, what are the neurotransmitters? So if you're going into nursing, this might come up when you start talking about drugs, okay? So the autonomic nervous system uses 2 neurotransmitters. It uses acetylcholine and it uses norepinephrine. Okay, now, they could stimulate something or they could inhibit something, but it depends on the receptor and what they're going to bind to. Okay, so if a cell releases acetylcholine, then they're called cholinergic neurons. Okay, so cholinergic neurons are all of the autonomic nervous system preganglionic neurons, all parasympathetic, sympathetic, and sympathetic ones that innerve sweat glands and blood vessels. Okay, now, target cells have what are called cholinergic receptors. Okay, cells that release norepinephrine, they're referred to as adrenergic. Most of the sympathetic ganglion neurons respond to norepinephrine. Okay, so they're adrenergic, or they release norepinephrine. Okay, so now, if we compare the 2 pathways and the neurotransmitters that are being released, okay, so parasympathetic, the preganglionic axon is going to release acetylcholine. Okay, and we have to talk about the receptors. Okay, the acetylcholine is going to bind to these receptors that are called nicotinic. Okay, nicotinic receptors are going to cause a change to occur, right? And acetylcholine will be released, and then they bind to these muscarinic receptors, which we're going to talk about here in a second. Okay, parasympathetic pathways can do different things. Okay, so they are going to release acetylcholine. So the pre's always release acetylcholine. Okay, they bind to nicotinic. Then this is where the change occurs. Okay, then they could release acetylcholine and bind to muscarinic, or they could release norepinephrine that might bind to adrenergic receptors, or they could release acetylcholine that's going to bind to nicotinic receptors. And that example is the adrenal medulla. Okay, so let's try it. I actually like this picture. I used to draw one of these, but this is a good one. So let's talk about the receptors and what's going to happen. Like, why do we care about this? Okay, so there are two types of cholinergic receptors. Okay, so think about a cell. It's got a receptor in the plasma membrane, and it's going to bind acetylcholine. Okay, nicotinic receptors, okay, are found on all ganglionic neurons and adrenal medulla cells. Okay, we also have them in skeletal muscle, and we'll talk about them in a couple chapters. Okay, whenever acetylcholine binds to a nicotinic receptor, it opens a cation channel. And guess what happens? Sodium moves in, okay, and the cell depolarizes and it gets excited. You guys are familiar with that. Okay, muscarinic receptors, okay, are found in target organs of the parasympathetic nervous system and a couple of the sympathetic. Muscarinic receptors, they have second messenger systems, but the different types of different subtypes of receptors have different effects. So when acetylcholine binds to muscarinic receptors, it causes muscle and smooth muscle to contract more. But whenever it binds to muscarinic receptors in the heart muscle, the heart rate slows down. So it does the opposite thing depending on where the receptor is, the organ. Okay, now, norepinephrine is what's called a catecholamine. Okay, so catecholamines are a type of neurotransmitter that are called biogenic amines. Okay, so they bind to receptors, right? They bind to adrenergic receptors. Okay, now, adrenergic receptors are divided into two kinds, alpha and beta. Okay, if you have an alpha receptor, you're usually stimulated by norepinephrine. If you are a beta receptor, you could be stimulated or inhibited. It depends. Okay. So alpha receptors, and I want you to know there's alpha and beta. Alpha 1 and alpha 2, I don't know that it matters, but you can kind of get the big picture. So alpha 1, okay, smooth muscle will contract. Okay, alpha 1 are in most blood vessels, so they'll cause your blood vessels to constrict. It'll cause you to have goosebumps. Okay, it causes the uterus to contract, dilates the pupil. Okay, now alpha 2, okay, are in your central nervous system and in your pancreas, and they're going to keep the sphincters closed so nothing moves through your digestive system. Okay, now beta receptors, actually, they'll be important when you start learning about drugs. Okay, so beta receptors, beta 1 are usually stimulatory. Okay, so they're located in your heart. So if they get stimulated, they're going to increase your heart rate and your force of your heartbeat. And they can stimulate renin secretion in your kidney, which we're not there yet. Okay, beta 2 receptors are usually inhibitory. Okay, so they're going to cause your vessel to dilate. And you guys can read this. Okay, and then beta 3, they could be either one. Okay, so have you heard of a beta blocker? Okay, so they're talking about blocking these receptors. Okay, so it's used to treat blood pressure. Okay, so if someone has high blood pressure, okay, they can give you a drug that will block these beta receptors. Okay, and then your force of your heart rate, the force of your heartbeat will decrease, right? And it'll slow everything down, and then it'll hopefully lower your blood pressure. Okay, now here's an example. Okay, so if someone has an asthma attack, okay, what happens is the bronchioles will constrict, okay, and you can't get air out or air in. Okay, the bronchioles actually have beta 2 receptors in them. Epinephrine is going to bind to the beta 2 receptors, okay, and it's going to cause the smooth muscle in the bronchioles to relax, okay? So that will slow everything down and you can breathe. Okay, so beta 2. So bronchodilation is what you need. Okay, so if they give you a rescue inhaler or something. Okay, now in our body and the way we stay upright and functioning and in homeostasis is the idea that the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system are both working continuously in like harmony or in equilibrium to help us maintain what they call autonomic tone. Okay, so autonomic tone is like your heart rate, your breathing rate, is your food digesting, that kind of thing. So most of the time, most things are controlled by both divisions. Okay, sometimes only one division controls it and not very often. Okay, so blood vessels are usually constricted a little bit because of sympathetic tone. Vagal tone, your heart rate is actually set higher than what you feel. And the vagus nerve, the vagal tone, actually slows it down. Okay, so dual innervation means that the organ's getting input from both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Okay, sometimes they work together and sometimes they don't. Okay, usually they're antagonistic. They're working opposite of each other. So the parasympathetic lowers your heart rate and the sympathetic increases your heart rate. So the cardiac cells have cholinergic and adrenergic receptors. Okay, another example is controlling the digestion. Okay, controlling the diameter of your pupil is another one. Sometimes there's cooperative effects. Okay, so they're going to work together. So male sexual function is an example. And you guys can read that. Okay, so penis erection due to parasympathetic. So, but then when you're excited, that's when ejaculation occurs, and that's sympathetic. Okay, now, things that are only controlled by the sympathetic nervous system are sweat glands in your trunk, erector pili muscles, which are around the hairs in your skin, and the adrenal medulla. Okay, now, autonomic reflexes. Okay, so autonomic reflexes are and you guys know what a reflex is now. It's a pre-programmed response to a stimulus. Okay, so you're still going to have the receptor, the sensory information going to the central nervous system integrating it, and then the motor neuron taking information out and causing a change. So with the autonomic nervous system, the effectors are going to be the heart, the cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. Okay, so that's the only thing, that's what they're going to affect. Okay, so one example of an autonomic reflex is a cardiovascular reflex, so blood pressure. So in your blood vessels, okay, we have stretch receptors. Okay, so if your blood pressure goes up, they're going to send more signal, and it's going to go to your medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is going to inhibit the sympathetic nervous system, and it's going to turn on the parasympathetic output to the heart. And the idea is that that's going to slow your heart rate down. It's going to reduce the amount of blood that's being ejected, and that should decrease your blood pressure. So if this goes up, this should go down, and you should never have to think about it. There's two more, and you guys can read these, and we'll talk about them when we get to the chapters on these. So how autonomic reflexes of defecation and urination. We talk about them when we get to those chapters. So let's just hang on to those. And there's the other one. We talk about that when we get to the kidney chapter. And that's in the GI chapter. Okay.